A simple date night, meant to be filled with laughter and joy, quickly turned into an unimaginable nightmare for a young couple in Knoxville, Tennessee. On January 6, 2007, Shannon Christian, just 21 years old, and her boyfriend, 23-year-old Hugh Christopher Newsom Jr., were living their best lives, unaware that their world would soon shatter. Their evening, planned as a fun night out, took a tragic and violent turn when they were carjacked by 5 ruthless men. What followed was nothing short of horrifying, a series of events so brutal, it will leave you questioning the depths of human cruelty. This isn't just another story. It's a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in the most ordinary moments. Stay with us as we delve into the heartbreaking tale of Shannon and Chris, 2 young people with dreams and aspirations, whose lives were stolen in the blink of an eye. But before we continue, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. Now, let's begin. Shannon Christian was born on April 29, 1985, in the small town of Nacogdoches, Texas, but her family moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, when she was just a young girl. From the moment she arrived, she found her place in the tight-knit community. Shannon was known for her radiant smile and her ability to light up any room she walked into. She had a heart of gold, always seeking ways to make life better for others. Whether it was volunteering or helping her neighbors, Shannon's passion for giving was evident to anyone who knew her. Her future seemed bright. She was a student at the University of Tennessee, pursuing a degree in sociology. Shannon wanted to make a real difference in people's lives, particularly in social services, where she believed she could use her compassion and understanding to help those in need. Her friends and family described her as loyal and kind, someone who never hesitated to lend a hand. In fact, even during her busy academic schedule, Shannon made sure to stay connected with her family, often visiting them on weekends, enjoying simple pleasures like home-cooked meals and laughter-filled nights playing board games. She was a loving daughter and sister, a person with a future full of potential, a future that was tragically cut short. Now, let's talk about Hugh Christopher Newsom Jr., known to his friends as Chris. Born and raised in Knoxville, Chris was the embodiment of hard work and dedication. He was a natural athlete, excelling in baseball during his high school years. He wasn't just good at the sport. He had the kind of leadership qualities that made everyone around him strive for excellence. But Chris wasn't only about sports. He had a deep love for the outdoors, often spending his weekends hunting and fishing, soaking in the beauty of Tennessee's landscapes. His passion for life was contagious, and his community respected him for his strong work ethic and commitment to his family. Chris was especially close to his family, particularly his younger sister, Andrea. He was a protector, a confidant, always willing to go the extra mile for the people he loved. With his sights set on building a stable and fulfilling life, Chris had dreams of starting his own family one day. Those who knew him described him as someone who would always be there when needed, a man of deep character and unwavering loyalty. Together, Shannon and Chris formed an inseparable bond. Their relationship was a reflection of their shared values: love, respect, and a desire to build a future filled with joy and togetherness. The love they shared was evident in their everyday actions. Chris surprising Shannon with her favorite snacks after a long day, and Shannon planning trips to the outdoors, knowing how much Chris loved nature. They were truly each other's greatest supporters. But on the night of January 6, 2007, a night that was meant to be full of happiness, their lives would take an unimaginable turn. The evening they had planned to enjoy together would become the darkest chapter in their lives, a chapter that would leave their families and a whole community forever broken. Stay tuned as we explore what happened on that fateful night and the tragic events that followed. It was supposed to be an ordinary night out. Shannon and Chris had made plans to attend a friend's party, something they had both been looking forward to. It was a simple, joyous evening, filled with the excitement of spending time with friends and enjoying each other's company. Little did they know, their world was about to be turned upside down in a matter of moments, as the young couple pulled into a parking lot in Knoxville, completely unaware of the danger lurking nearby. fate had a much darker plan in store for them. The five perpetrators, Lamarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, Vanessa Coleman, and Eric Boyd, had been on the hunt that evening, looking for their next victim. With nothing but criminal intentions in their hearts, they drove through the area, seeking an opportunity to strike. It didn't take long before they spotted Shannon and Chris in the parking lot. The couple, completely oblivious to the danger closing in, stood by Shannon's SUV, sharing a moment of affection. That brief, quiet moment between the two would be the last moment of peace they would experience. The five individuals, armed and ready to cause harm, saw the couple as a perfect target. They moved quickly, approaching the couple's vehicle with terrifying speed. At gunpoint, they forced Shannon and Chris into the back seat of the car, their lives suddenly ripped away from them in an instant. The laughter and excitement of the evening were replaced by fear and helplessness. In a flash, they were no longer in control of their own fate. The young couple, bound and terrified, were thrust into a nightmare they never could have imagined. The perpetrators made no attempt to hide their intentions, and as the car drove away from the parking lot, the horror that would follow began to unfold. No one could have predicted that an ordinary night out would turn into such a brutal and tragic event. The nightmare only deepened as the couple was driven further into hell. The car sped through Knoxville's darkened streets, the sounds of their captors' threats echoing in their ears, filling them with an unbearable sense of dread. The perpetrators showed no mercy, continuously terrorizing Shannon and Chris with their cruel words and actions. Along the way, they stole Chris's wallet, phone, and shoes, stripping him of everything that once symbolized his normal life. The journey ended at Davidson's rented home on Chipman Street, a place that would become the backdrop for the most horrific hours of their lives. Here, the true terror began. Once inside the house, Chris was immediately separated from Shannon. His world went black as he was taken to another room. What followed was a brutal attack. He was savagely beaten, physically and sexually assaulted. His body, bruised and broken, was pushed to the edge of endurance. But the horrors didn't stop there. As if the torment wasn't enough, Chris was dragged out into the night and forced to walk barefoot toward the nearby railroad tracks. There, in the cold darkness, his tormentors showed no hesitation. They shot him multiple times, with the final, fatal shot aimed directly to his head. But even in death, Chris wasn't allowed peace. His body was set on fire, an attempt to destroy any trace of their cruelty. Meanwhile, Shannon's ordeal was just beginning. Inside Davidson's house, she was subjected to hours of unimaginable violence. The medical examiner's report would later confirm the extent of the brutal assaults, detailing the sexual and physical torment she endured. The young woman, once full of life, found herself trapped in a hellish nightmare, unable to escape her captor's grip, in a desperate attempt to cover their tracks. The perpetrators even poured bleach on Shannon's body, erasing any evidence they could. Yet no matter what they did to try and hide the truth, it couldn't change what was happening. Shannon was still alive, her body enduring unimaginable violence as she fought to survive. But the brutality didn't end with just physical wounds. She was bound in a horrific way, left to suffer without mercy. The suffering continued until she was finally placed in a trash bin, alive but slowly suffocating as hours stretched into days. In those final moments, Shannon's life was cruelly taken away, but the trauma she endured would leave a lasting mark on all who would later learn of her tragic fate. The search for answers began the moment Chris's body was discovered. Early on the morning of January 7th, a railroad worker, going about his usual routine, stumbled upon the charred remains of a body near the railroad tracks. The scene was nothing short of horrifying. Chris's lifeless body, burned beyond recognition, had been carelessly discarded as if it were no more than trash. The railroad worker immediately called the authorities, and soon after, law enforcement arrived to process the scene. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through the community, and the investigation into Chris's death was quickly underway. While investigators focused on the grim discovery of Chris's body, they turned their attention to finding Shannon. As the hours ticked by with no sign of the young woman, her family and friends grew frantic. Text messages and phone calls to both Shannon and Chris went unanswered. It wasn't long before the realization set in. Something terrible had happened on January 8th. A significant break in the case came when Shannon's vehicle was found abandoned miles away from the scene of the crime. Inside the car, investigators found items that didn't belong to the couple, including personal belongings and cigarettes. These items would later be traced back to the perpetrators, but there was still no sign of Shannon. The search continued relentlessly that on January 9th, police executed a search warrant at the Chipman Street house, the same house where Shannon and Chris had been held captive. What they found inside would haunt them forever. In the kitchen, tucked away in a trash bin, were 5 large garbage bags. When the officers opened the bags, they were met with an unspeakable sight. Shannon's body was found hogtied, with severe injuries from the violent assault she had endured. She had been left to suffocate slowly, her face covered with a plastic bag, her life drained away in the most horrific manner. The brutality of the crime left investigators, the community, and Shannon's family in utter shock. The discovery of her body marked the end of a search, but it also signaled the beginning of an unrelenting pursuit of justice for the young couple whose lives had been violently and senselessly taken. The investigation into the brutal murders of Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom was nothing short of a Herculean effort. Law enforcement from Knoxville Police and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, TBI, collaborated tirelessly, determined to bring those responsible to justice. With very few leads at the outset, the authorities worked around the clock, meticulously piecing together the sparse evidence. One of the first breakthroughs came when investigators found fingerprints inside Shannon's abandoned vehicle. The discovery of these prints, along with DNA evidence, helped establish the link between the perpetrators and the crime scene. Forensic analysis provided further confirmation of the identities of the criminals involved. As the investigation continued, law enforcement connected the dots, and all signs pointed to 5 individuals who would later become infamous for their horrific crimes: Lamarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, Vanessa Coleman, and Eric Boyd. The investigation revealed that these 5 individuals, each with a troubled history, had crossed paths in Knoxville. They had not only been involved in the kidnapping, assault, and murders of Shannon and Chris, but had also lived lives steeped in criminality. Lamarcus Davidson, the ringleader, had a long and violent criminal history. Born in Memphis, Tennessee, Davidson had spent time in prison for previous offenses, including aggravated robbery and carjacking. Released just months before the murders, he moved to Knoxville, where he quickly returned to his criminal ways. His manipulative and dominant personality led him to take charge of the group, orchestrating the crimes with ruthless precision. Latalvis Cobbins, Davidson's half-brother, had also been exposed to a life of crime from a young age. Growing up in a dysfunctional family, Cobbins developed a criminal record of his own, including an attempted robbery charge. Despite his claims of being a reluctant participant, Cobbins was found to have played an active role in the abduction and assault of Shannon and Chris. George Thomas, known by his alias Detroit, had a criminal history rooted in Michigan. Like Cobbins and Davidson, Thomas had long been associated with criminal circles. Though he consistently denied direct involvement in the crimes, his presence at the crime scene and failure to intervene implicated him as an accessory to the brutal acts. Vanessa Coleman, the only woman in the group, came from a relatively stable family in Kentucky. Her involvement in the crime shocked many who knew her. Initially, Coleman claimed that she was coerced into participating, but evidence later contradicted her account, and her actions during the crimes painted a different story. She was found guilty of aiding and abetting the crimes, though she was later sentenced to a reduced sentence after a retrial. Eric Boyd, a career criminal with a history of armed robbery and car theft, was initially convicted of being an accessory after the fact. However, years later, new evidence surfaced, and Boyd was charged with direct involvement in the murders. His role in assisting Davidson and the group's escape was undeniable, making him an integral part of the crime's execution as the investigation unfolded. It became clear that this was not just a random act of violence, but a deeply orchestrated crime that involved a web of lies, manipulation, and brutality. Law enforcement, backed by forensic evidence, was now ready to move forward with bringing these dangerous criminals to trial. With each step of the investigation, the horrific nature of the crime became more apparent, and the families of Shannon and Chris found themselves holding on to the hope that justice would prevail. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement faced a maze of lies and contradictions from the suspects, each trying to avoid responsibility for the horrific crimes they had committed. The first breakthrough came during the interrogations, where each of the suspects had to face the undeniable weight of forensic evidence and witness testimonies that directly linked them to the abductions, tortures, and murders of Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom. Initially, the suspects denied any involvement. Lamarcus Davidson, the ringleader, was the first to be interrogated. At first, he vehemently denied having any part in the crimes, claiming that he had no knowledge of the events that took place at Chipman Street. However, as law enforcement confronted him with mounting forensic evidence, his story began to fall apart. Davidson's denials were eventually shattered when DNA evidence, linking him directly to the crime scene, was presented. Faced with irrefutable proof, Davidson began to shift his story. He changed his narrative multiple times, but each version only made his involvement more apparent. Eventually, he confessed to his role in orchestrating the attack on the young couple, implicating his half-brother Latalvis Cobbins and other co-conspirators. Latalvis Cobbins, initially claiming to be a passive observer of the crimes, also began to crack under pressure. As investigators continued to present irrefutable forensic evidence and the testimonies of other suspects, Cobbins' role became clear. He admitted to being involved in the sexual assault and murder of Shannon Christian, though he downplayed his overall role in the violence. His confession, though reluctant, gave authorities the crucial information they needed to solidify the case against him. George Thomas, who had maintained throughout the investigation that he was merely a bystander to the crimes, was also interrogated. His claims were quickly disproven when investigators presented evidence showing his active involvement. Despite his denials, witness testimony placed him at the scene during the entire ordeal. Eventually, Thomas's story began to unravel, and he too was forced to admit his participation. The interrogations of Vanessa Coleman and Eric Boyd were equally as revealing. Coleman, initially presenting herself as a victim of coercion, claimed she had been forced to take part in the crime against her will. However, investigators uncovered journal entries and testimonies from other members of the group that contradicted her claims. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Coleman admitted her role in the abduction and abuse of Shannon Christian, though she continued to downplay her actions in the attack. Eric Boyd, who had been initially charged as an accessory after the fact, was later brought into custody for his direct involvement in the crime. Boyd had tried to deflect responsibility, but as more evidence surfaced, he too was implicated in the murders. His role in assisting the group during the carjacking and helping to cover up the crime was undeniable. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became clear that these 5 individuals had not only committed a horrific crime, but had also orchestrated a brutal attack that left 2 families shattered. With the confessions of Davidson, Cobbins, and Thomas, the truth began to emerge, an unimaginable story of violence, fear, and cruelty. The suspects were now facing the consequences of their actions, and the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. Davidson, the ringleader, was arrested after a manhunt and subsequently confessed to his role in the crime, implicating the others. His arrest was followed by the capture of the remaining suspects, each of whom had varying degrees of cooperation with investigators. While some, like Cobbins and Thomas, admitted their involvement, others, such as Coleman and Boyd, continued to downplay their actions until the full scope of their crimes was laid bare. With each arrest, a new layer of the story emerged, painting a clearer picture of the brutality Shannon and Chris had endured. What started as a routine investigation had now turned into a relentless pursuit of justice for the victims and their families. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but one thing was certain: those responsible for the senseless murders would be held accountable. The journey toward justice for Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom took another crucial step forward when the trials for the 5 perpetrators began in 2008. The courtroom became a battleground for justice as the victims' families, the community of Knoxville, and the nation looked on, hoping for accountability and closure. Lamarcus Davidson, the ringleader, was the first to face the court. He was convicted on multiple charges, including first-degree murder and premeditated murder. In October 2009, Davidson was sentenced to death for his horrific role in the murders of Shannon and Chris. His actions had not only taken 2 innocent lives, but also shattered the hearts of their families. Davidson's conviction was a moment of justice, but it could never bring back the lives that were lost. Despite his attempts to deflect blame during his trial, the overwhelming evidence against him sealed his fate. His death sentence would stand as a reminder of the brutality he inflicted upon his victims. LaTalvis Cobbins and George Thomas were also convicted for their roles in the tragic events. Cobbins, who had been a willing participant in the violent crimes, was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Despite his attempts to minimize his involvement, the evidence was clear, and his conviction ensured that he would never be able to harm anyone again. George Thomas, who had denied his active participation in the crimes, was found guilty on multiple charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for each of the 4 capital convictions. His convictions were later reduced to second-degree murder after a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against Eric Boyd. Vanessa Coleman, the youngest member of the group, faced charges for her role in facilitating the crimes. Initially, Coleman was sentenced to 53 years in prison for her involvement. However, after a retrial in 2013, her sentence was reduced to 35 years. Throughout the trial, Coleman claimed that she was coerced into participating in the crimes, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Her actions during and after the crimes were too incriminating to ignore. Eric Boyd was another key figure in the case. Initially convicted in federal court in 2008 for being an accessory to the fatal carjacking, Boyd was sentenced to 18 years in prison. It wasn't until 2019 that Boyd faced state-level charges for his direct involvement in the murders. After a lengthy trial, Boyd was found guilty on multiple counts, including premeditated first-degree murder, and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 90 years in prison. The convictions of these 5 individuals marked a turning point in the case, but the road to justice was far from over. The families of Shannon and Chris, though deeply affected by the years-long legal proceedings, took solace in the fact that the perpetrators had been held accountable for their actions. They fought not just for justice, but for the memory of their children, whose lives were stolen far too soon. This case garnered national attention, sparking discussions about race, media coverage, and the justice system. Many questioned why the brutal murders of a young white couple seemed to go largely unnoticed by mainstream media, while others argued that the media's portrayal of the crime was not as significant as the need to ensure that justice was served. Regardless of the media's response, the real story was the pain and devastation felt by the families involved. Knoxville came together in a collective expression of grief and support for the families. Vigils were held, and the community rallied to honor the lives of Shannon and Chris. The couple, whose future had been filled with promise, had their lives stolen in an act of unspeakable cruelty. But in the wake of their tragic deaths, the city found strength in unity, and the pursuit of justice ensured that the memory of Shannon and Chris would live on. While the legal process provided some sense of closure, the scars of this case will forever remain in the hearts of their families and the Knoxville community. But it also served as a reminder of the importance of standing up for justice, no matter the obstacles. In the end, those responsible were held accountable, and Shannon and Chris families can take comfort in knowing that their voices were heard. As we reflect on the tragic deaths of Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom, we are reminded of the darkness that can sometimes lurk in unexpected places. What was meant to be a simple night out turned into a nightmare that shattered lives, tore apart families, and sent ripples of grief through an entire community. The brutality of their deaths is unimaginable, yet the courage of their families and the relentless pursuit of justice provided a sense of closure in the midst of this tragedy. Shannon and Chris families were left to navigate a painful journey of loss, but through their unwavering strength, they ensured that their children's memory would not be forgotten. The community of Knoxville, deeply shaken by the brutality of the crime, came together in solidarity to honor the victims and demand justice. The story of Shannon and Chris is one that will never fade from the hearts of those who knew them, and their legacy continues to inspire others to fight for what is right. Justice was served, though no sentence could ever truly replace the lives lost. The tireless work of law enforcement, the dedication of the legal system, and the bravery of the families involved ensured that those responsible for this heinous act would face the consequences of their actions. As we wrap up this heartbreaking story, let us remember Shannon and Chris, not just for the tragedy they endured, but for the love and potential they had in their short lives. May their story continue to inspire change, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. Thank you for watching. If you found this video impactful, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world, and it helps us continue telling these important stories. Stay tuned for more real-life stories that make a difference, and thank you for being part of our community.